today, so it's really great to see. And thanks for all of your comments. Yeah, definitely, overwhelmingly majority sort of answering yes to the question, but obviously a few no's as well. So we'll delve into some of those issues as well. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be co-hosting today's session this afternoon. Just to reiterate my thanks, we're going to obviously come to our guest presenters in a couple of minutes. This is a great topic for me. I think it cuts across everything that and I'm sure loads of you are all trying to juggle at the moment, both personally and professionally. So for those that don't know me, I'm Sarah Griffiths. I'm the Deputy Regional Director of Finance for NHS England in the East of England region. I'm relatively new to the NHS, I guess. I joined under 3 years ago. I actually spent most of my career up until that point working in the private sector in a global organisation. And I think what's clear to me is we've got a huge way to go in the UK in this space. So the organisation that I worked for in prior to the NHS, they were part Swedish. They've got a completely different approach to these things, even just starting with paternity leave. So for instance, 90 days minimum ring fenced for both parents and sort of 15 months overall that can be shared between both parents across the course for each child, really. I saw this work really, really well in practice with Scandinavian colleagues. It just shows that it can be done and it can be normalised. So let's just have that in mind. So back to kind of what we're going to talk about today. We had, as you'll all be aware, a really great live Women in Leadership for Finance event last summer in London. A lot of the themes coming out from that were around balancing career choices alongside other commitments such as family and caring responsibilities. And traditionally, although not always, traditionally women have borne the brunt of a lot of the impact of this through pregnancy, birthing, breastfeeding, etc. And that's obviously sort of typically has been the case, but obviously we'll talk about sort of one or two sort of areas where that's not been the case as well. This can often have an adverse effect on the pipeline, career choices and opportunities for future female leaders, and can often disrupt careers just as those individuals are kind of climbing the career ladder, if you like. And so it clearly has an impact on the pipeline there. We've discussed this in a number of our other webinars, kind of termed it up as the motherhood penalty anyway. Today, we've got 3 fabulous working parents on our panel, and we're going to discuss and explore how balancing their careers and their family has affected them. And I'll ask each of those presenters to introduce themselves in a couple of minutes. So just a couple of housekeeping things as well first. So we always want today's session to be as engaging as possible. So there will be loads of opportunity for you to ask questions. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, but also raise your hand, put your camera on if you want to ask questions. We'll run until around 12:55, but myself and Nicola will be hanging around for another 10 or 15 minutes anyway, if people want to continue the discussion to stay on. So why don't we get started? Can I ask our presenters to introduce themselves? Is it okay if we go first of all, Mike, then Victoria, then Henry, if that's okay? Thank you.
Yep, that's fine. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Nicola. So my name's Mike Fox. I'm the Chief Finance Officer for South East London ICB. I've been doing that now it'll be coming up for 2 years in the early spring. I've been in the NHS all my career, and Henry's not allowed to say how long that has been. But it's been a long time, so we've seen an awful lot of changes, both structurally, but I'd like to hope and think that we're beginning to see more changes in terms of approach and views to work and home life balance and things around that, not just for women but for all carers. And I think that's an absolute requirement. Let's just put it in the context of how many people and the talent we're probably wasting. So for those that aren't aware, I have my wife is also on the call. It's Victoria Jeffries, as you will see here, and we've been married since 2012. We have 2 children. We've got 2 little boys, a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And they are, as you can imagine, two little boys. They are a bundle of energy and a heck of an effort to keep on top of, as little boys tend to be, and small children are. This is somewhat compounded by our eldest child, Jacob, who is 6 years old. He also has autism and ADHD, and we have had to take an awful lot of time, not only with being parents to Jacob, but also trying to access and navigate the various support and health systems. As a person in the NHS trying to navigate the health system is still a challenge for Jacob, to ensure that he's had the right diagnosis, the right treatment, and the right support at school, which has not been easy. What does our home family life look like? I'd like to think fairly normal, hopefully, but it's, as you can imagine, it's quite high paced, juggling of parental responsibilities. So pretty much every week, myself and Tor sit down and almost look at our diaries and figure out, well, who's going to be taking over from our childcare. And because of Jacob's condition, traditional childcare doesn't work for him. He can't cope with it, so it's we have a part-time nanny, but one of us has to take over from the nanny. And every week we have to figure that out. And a further challenge can be that, a slight first world crisis, I'm sure, but just before Christmas, our nanny was off sick for 3 weeks. So our usual plan went thoroughly in the bin, and we were almost on a day-by-day basis trying to figure out how to prioritize between us all, how to look after the children and make sure it worked. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. Tor, do you want to go next and add to that? Thanks. Introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi. So professionally, people probably know me as Tor Jeffries. Obviously, my married name is Fox, as I am married to Mike. So I've had a bit of a different career for someone as a finance professional. So I joined the grad scheme in 2006 on the finance scheme. Following that, I went to work for Guy's and St Thomas as a finance manager. I then went to West London Mental Health because they got a really interesting role that was actually a mix of finance, performance and contracting. From that, I actually ended up being headhunted to go and work for Monitor, and that was in the days when actually you just deal with what came across your desk. So some days you'd be dealing with quality issues, some it'd be performance, some it'd be finance. I mean, at one point I ended up dealing with mortuaries. I mean, it was quite varied from a point of view of a portfolio. And then I've stayed in central regulation. So I went from Monitor to NHSI, and I'm currently employed by NHSE, where I'm Deputy Director for Intensive Support for London. As Mike says, we've got 2 boys. The first one was born in 2017, second one 2019. So that meant that I did actually come back in the middle of the pandemic, where I ended up doing a lot of work on the vaccine programme. Now, for any of you who were actually around at the time of the vaccine programme, it was very intense. And actually, I ended up doing 80-hour weeks on the vaccine programme, plus 40-hour weeks with the kids. I'm not sure when I actually slept, but a lot of that was, again, as Mike said, there was a lot of scheduling about actually both being clear with work when I was available, but also at home from a point of view of actually being there for the kids before they went to nursery and in an evening and on a weekend. And there were calls with various chief execs with a baby sat waving to various different people. As Mike says, we've had a number of challenges, particularly related to making sure the right care and support is in place for Jacob. And from a personal point of view, the bit that he didn't pick up on was actually typically when these kind of things start happening is when a child goes to school. And what basically happened is all of our care fell to pieces. So we were expecting to be able to put him in wraparound. The first thing that happened is the school gradually pulled each individual bit of wraparound. And so again, we were doing a lot of diary management and things to actually be able to make sure that we were there to support him. From a point of view of a woman who'd actually taken time out to have children, yes, I'd taken the 2 years out on maternity leave. The other bit for context that may or may not have affected some of you is actually both boys are from IVF as well. I was very lucky with my employer. They were quite supportive and they were quite happy for me to work remotely in the IVF clinics. So I spent a lot of time while all these tests and investigations were going on actually working in the reception area of IVF clinics. So I was very lucky to have a supportive employer. And again, I would say that with NHS England, I've got a very supportive employer from a point of view, as Mike says, when we have things like the nanny falls through, to actually be able to work from home a bit more, to be able to work flexibly. I've got some very good line managers who are very clear that it's about delivery. It's not about that you're doing 9 to 5 and when you're actually doing it. So I'm very lucky from that point of view. And I do feel that the way that people are working now post-COVID actually enables carers either of very young children or of children with these kind of things. Or, for example, you know, one thing Mike didn't pick up is my mum fell over on the weekend, so I'm probably going to have to go up and do some looking after her. But again, I'd be able to work remotely. So I think things are getting better, but I do think it does depend on your employer. I've worked in some places where actually I don't think I would have had the support and ability to do it. And I think there's some places that I've worked where actually even now I probably wouldn't be able to have those frank conversations with my line managers, whereas actually my line managers are very supportive. I've never had any worry or concern about approaching them about any form of flexibility. So personally, I feel very lucky, but I do think it's about some organisations are further ahead on that journey than others. Anyway, sorry, I've rambled for a little bit, so I'll hand over.
Thanks, Tor. And Henry, you good to go next?
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Nicola, and hi, everyone. I'm Henry Black. I'm the CFO for North East London ICB. So, like Mike, I've been doing this particular role for coming up for 2 years in the spring. But I've been a kind of CCG CFO for, well, since 2013. So it feels like quite a long time. But my kind of parental story is slightly different, and I'm slightly at the other end of the spectrum. Even though Mike and I are the same age, and we were both on the, we've known each other for 25 years, Mike, and we were both on the same 99 intake, which is sorry about that. Sorry to give it away, but my daughter is 27. And so she was born, and Mike will remember this, that I was that weird bloke who, even when we were doing our studies and we were at the kind of college, I would occasionally have to leave at 4 o'clock when everyone else went to the pub because I had to go and do my childcare. But my daughter was born when I was in my second year of university. You might not be completely surprised to hear that the relationship didn't last the test of time. And so I was effectively a shared kind of had shared parental responsibility from quite an early age, from my early 20s. So I wasn't a single parent in the sense of being the sole carer, but I was, you know, I was the kind of joint carer. And for the period when I had my daughter, it was just me. And so what I would say is that that's kind of where the things are different. But what is similar in terms of my experience compared to Tor and Mike is that I was really fortunate to have a very supportive employer. I mean, it makes me sound so old to say it, but things were quite different back then. It was, you know, we didn't quite have the same, I suppose you'd call it a kind of cultural aspect of an expectation of shared parenting. It was quite unusual for the circumstances that I was in, and I had special arrangements where I would leave work on a Thursday at 3:30. Core hours were, well, supposedly 9 to 5, but I think, you know, between 10 and 4 was the expectation, and then time either side. But it was unusual for somebody to be, you know, basically I think I was a band 7 at the time, to be permitted to leave the office at 3:30 on a Thursday. But I was fortunate that I was able to do that. So the other days of the week, my daughter was in childminder until 6:30, so that was basically workable. So I didn't have to compromise working hours. But you know, it's when she would fall ill, or when there were you know, need extra care or whatever, then that would always be a bit of an issue. But generally speaking, you know, again, you can't guarantee that you'll have that kind of understanding employer. But I have been very, very fortunate, and I have been very conscious of the fact that I guess being, having a support employer, but also it being slightly odd and unusual, I think that kind of made it harder for my organisation to sort of do anything other than just accept it when I said that's what I wanted to do, because it almost felt a bit novel. But yeah, that's my story.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks. Go on, Nicola. I was going to hand over to you.
Sorry, I was going to say thank you to all of you there for sharing. That's some very different situations actually, but so hopefully it gives us a bit of a kind of a spread that many people in our audience today can identify with and perhaps have some questions around. I mean, I think the examples that we have today is more of a heterosexual parenting model, which I appreciate may not be the norm for everyone, but there's certainly quite a lot of discussion points that we can bring up today. So I'd like to start off actually at something that Mike said about you both share the responsibility, Mike and Tor, for taking over from the nanny, from your part-time nanny. And I just wanted to ask you how you decided to do that, and who, it's quite difficult to get an equal balance in a partnership, but who makes space for whom? Because when I think back to when my kids were born, which is 15 years ago now, again, sound a bit like Henry, it's different times then as well, not just 27 years ago when you had your daughter, Henry. But my husband and I didn't really even have that discussion. It was just fully assumed that as the carrier of the children, I had twins, that I would be the one who took a year's maternity leave and who did the majority of the childcare. In fact, we arranged for childcare thereafter so that I could go back to work, and we then went part-time. So it's so interesting now to see that being much more of a, or maybe it's not, maybe it's just the example that we have today, but more of a kind of common conversation that happens. But how did that happen between the two of you, if I'm not asking too much personal information, and how did you come to an arrangement that works between you?
You want to go first, or?
Yeah. If I go first, then I'll hand over to you. So I think there's a couple of bits. So going back to your point about maternity, we were both very clear. I mean, in one way, we were older parents. We were both over 30 when we had our children. So we both hit a certain point career-wise, which possibly was a bit helpful. But just before we had Jacob, that was when the new regulations came out about shared maternity leave. And we both looked into it because actually we thought, well, wouldn't that be great? I could do 6 months, Mike could do 6 months. And actually what we found out from both of our organisations was actually the way it was being interpreted, it was financially disincentive to do it. We would actually have lost money as a household if I'd done 6 months and he'd done 6 months. So that ended up being a financial decision that I took the 12 months off. From a point of view of how we work it, I mean, we work it the only way we can work it, which is actually we prioritise our diaries. So we're both hybrid working, so we both do 2 days a week in the office. Mike stays in the office on Monday, Wednesday, mine is Tuesday, Thursday. Interestingly enough, the current job I'm doing, actually, they need me on site on a Monday, but I've had a conversation with them and explained that is actually Mike's office day. I can get there and be there from 10 until 4, but I've got the nanny either side, and they're okay with that because they understand that that's how it works, and they know that I'll be doing work in the evening or whatever, so they will get the hours from me. From a point of view of what Mike's saying with the diaries is basically we do sometimes, particularly when the nanny's been off, we've had to put the diaries side by side and go, okay, who's got a board meeting? That takes priority. And then, we've almost got 2 or 3 different rankings of priorities of meetings, and we'll go through it. And I mean, there's been some days where actually one of us is, there's been some where I've taken half a day off as carer's leave because it just made more sense. There's been some where literally we're almost tag teaming every half an hour because of how the meetings have worked. And we've just got to be open and honest about it, because actually that's the way that both of us are able to do our jobs, but it is also, and we're both lucky, I think, with our employers, they understand that that's how they're getting the most out of it as well. But I'll hand over to Mike for his thoughts, because that's just my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think how did we get to that place? I suppose there's a couple of reflections from me. The first one is, I think if I think back to when I was a child and the amount of time I saw my dad, and my dad did his best, but it was a different world. It was a different generation. The expectation was that, and people correct me if they had different places, but the dad's out there working God knows how many hours of a day. You'll be lucky if you see them during the week, maybe at the weekend, and the mum's doing the vast majority of the childcare. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That was just what it was. But I wanted something different in being a dad. I wanted to be much more active generally in my children's upbringing, day-to-day school life and things like that. So I've always been motivated that that's what I would want to be, is more of an equal partner. But I think also in Tor has always been very clear about her desire for her career and to build her career. And I've always been clear that I would support her in that. And I see that as part of this, that I'm supporting Tor, I'm supporting my children, and I wanted to be a more active parent. I think in terms of how we've tried to manage it, a bit that maybe Tor didn't pick up on as well, is we've been very clear with our bosses about this all the way, but also about some of the sort of what we perceive as sensible ways of prioritizing between us, what gets first dibs. And I do worry that sometimes it's are there too many men where their careers take priority irrespective? And maybe that's the employers pushing that forward, or society, or whoever. But actually, is there that frank and honest discussion with employers and between partners of, there's a hierarchy of priorities for each business, and we have to try and manage it between us. But that's, for me, how we came to the balance. And it isn't always balanced, I'll be honest. It isn't always perfect.
Thank you. I can imagine it isn't always. And so a question kind of like leading on from that, and more in a sort of operational context. Henry mentioned it earlier, and that his employers kind of, because it was so new, so novel, in back in the day, whenever that would have been 99, 2000, so thereabouts. Oh no, even earlier than that. Your daughter was born then, if you were still at uni. Yeah.
It was early 2000s when I had this arrangement of leaving on a Thursday at 3:30.
Yeah.
Probably 2003, 4-ish, something like that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so my question is going to be, in fact, I could start with you, Henry, and you can talk us through how that went down in the office then, but also I'm interested to hear Mike and Tor's experience of how the team, not just the leaders, people that you report into, but your peers, but also those that report into you, how they've reacted to your commitment and openness around your family responsibilities. But if you start with Henry.
Well, I'll start. So I mean, it's really hard to say. I mean, at first it was such a long time ago, it's quite hard to remember, but I do think that whole point about it being novel definitely gave me, and I'll say, I mean, I've had, being an assertive white man, I've had loads of advantages, and it is probably another one of those, I would be honest, and just be really candid to say that I wouldn't be at all surprised if I'd been, a woman in that situation or a similar situation. It might just have felt too difficult to ask. So, I just think it's important that kind of, cultural stuff does get exposed. And that's what I try and do now when people I sort of receive that same kind of request, or I try and encourage as much as possible. I know Mike and Tor have already said that there are financial limitations, for fully shared parental leave, but it is a real bugbear of mine, and I feel like turning into a bit of a campaigner at times, that and it kind of goes back to what Sarah was saying at the beginning, that this kind of cultural norm whereby women will take a big chunky career break effectively right at that point in time, it just feels completely wrong. Sorry, I'm probably straying off topic now, Nicola, onto an item you want to talk about in a bit more detail. So,
there's so much to talk about here, and in fact, there's been already some really good questions coming in, which I will come back to, because they're definitely areas that we need to explore. But no, thanks for that, Henry. Tor and Mike, what about your teams and your peers, how they've reacted to the way that you've decided to juggle your diaries?
I'll go first this time because Tor went first last time, so we'll flip it back that way. I think this sort of I've had mixed experiences is what I'd say, and some of that's probably because of being in with different teams, different employers, but also different times pre and post pandemic. Because I do think there has been a significant difference as a result of the change in working patterns and an ability to be more flexible through post-pandemic. I do know that's variable because some places are moving back towards pre-pandemic ways of working as opposed to post-pandemic. I think it's absolutely clear that there was at times significant tension around leaving early. Especially when you almost feel yourself, if you like, just creeping away from whoever's talking to you mid-sentence because you know you've got to go and catch a train, and eventually you've just got to be robust and say, that's great, fine, text me, leave me alone, I'm going, I'm out the door, I'm waving as you're talking to me, but there's things that are a priority. I think what Henry said there, I think about being, for people who are unclear, we are both white males. We know and we've seen, and the statistics are clear, it is a huge advantage. And so actually, whether it's explicit or implicit, there's that, say it outright, Henry, there's that element of the cockiness about as well. We probably would just say, oh, well, this is what we're doing, rather than, oh, would you please mind? And that's not fair that it boils down to that in reality, and it's wrong. And I think I'd just like to put something else out there. It's been talked about, how does work react to you leaving early? Childcare doesn't start at the end of the school day or the end of other childcare. It starts at the start of the day when they get up to getting them to either school or etc. etc. So actually there's also that tension at the start of the day. We've come through pandemic where huge numbers of meetings were scheduled for 8 in the morning because various people could only meet at 8 in the morning because of everything else planned in. A lot of that's still pervasive in the system. Well, I don't know any school that starts at 8 in the morning. And there's an underlying tone of, well, sort it out. So it is really challenging. And I think the other way I sort of have dealt with it, managed it, is if you work with me, you're probably bored to tears about hearing about my children. Because I do talk about them and I do tell people about them and I do tell people what's going on with them, and I do then say, oh, by the way, I'm going to go and pick them up, bye-bye. So maybe that's just part of normalizing the fact that people are carers. And it's not just, as Tor said, it's not just caring for children. Hopefully, you all still have parents that are growing old and seeing your children, their grandchildren. They're probably becoming more infirm, and we will all get there. So we're also carers for not just children, but also maybe our own parents and grandparents. So all of these things are going to have to become normalized, I think.
Thanks, Mike. Tor, what have your team been like when you've had these conversations?
My team has been generally very, very supportive. I think whilst I'm very clearly not a white male, just for the avoidance of doubt. I think one thing that I would say, and I think this is one thing that I've had quite a lot of interesting conversations with a number of people relatively recently about, actually, is personality types. So my Myers-Briggs, I'm an ENTJ. That's the one that, it's nicknamed the what's field commander or whatever, field marshal. That's the one. So I'm quite naturally able to sit down and say, look, I need to have this conversation with you. I'm going to have this conversation with you. I completely understand that may not be most people's comfort zones, but likewise, I'm also lucky in the sense of the people that I work with, and that I've got a very good relationship with the people I work with, that I think even if that wasn't my personality style, I'd still feel comfortable approaching them to have those kind of conversations. Again, one of the other things, kind of slightly going back to Richard's point in the chat, actually, about do I feel it's impacted my career progression? Well, no, I don't. I went from an 8D to a 9 when I had Jacob. I've been in a band 9 for about the past 5-6 years. The thing that's limited my career progression, frankly, is that there's not that many ESN roles going compared to band 9s. That's actually what's limited it, not the opportunities. I came back from maternity second time into a global pandemic with 2 or 3 different regional directors in the region, arguing who would get me when I came back, because I got a very good track record of actually delivering what I was doing. And again, actually, the only way I was able to manage that is I had to have a very, very frank conversation. And, you know, anybody who knew me pre-kids would say that my work-life balance is awful. I was one of these people who's in the office at 7:30 in the morning. I was in there until 8, 9 at night. The thing having kids has actually taught me is that I can be more efficient and get stuff done during the day and manage my workload. And actually, there was a lot of stuff I was doing that I didn't need to do. It didn't deliver anything or anything else. So it's made me more efficient. But actually, the conversation I had to have coming back into the pandemic was actually, do not call me before 8 a.m. unless it is an absolute emergency. That's my kids' time. Don't call me between 6 and 8 p.m. That's my kids' time. I'll have my kids to bed at 9. You can phone me between 9 and 11. And then on a weekend, again, I was available between 1 and 3, and I was available after 8 p.m. And I literally set those times with people. And don't get me wrong, there were a couple of calls out within those hours, but that was over a whole year. And that was the way to actually manage it. So it had to be very clean and crisp. And actually, because we'd set those boundaries and rules at the beginning, and I appreciate that might be a difficult conversation for some people to initiate. But because we'd done that, I think it was easier for everybody, my line managers, my colleagues, because it was kind of like, well, yeah, you know, I'm not around. Oh, yeah, I'm around. It kind of softened the conversations, if that made sense, because we all knew what the expectations was. Sorry, I rabbited a bit.
That's great, thank you. I think since we're this is very relevant, actually. Jane Chalfont's question. Jane, I don't know if you're there. I don't know if you want to ask it personally, or equally, I'm happy to ask on your behalf. I just thought it fits in quite well with what Tor's just said about being, or having been an extreme workaholic with no work-life balance previously, and then coming into a situation where now you have additional responsibilities, and you know, doesn't mean overcompensating. Do you want to ask the question, Jane? I'll go mute now.
Yeah. I had a curiosity there, because I think part of the way that I behave is more to do with my own human behaviours to manage it. But I was asking the question about whether you felt pressured to overcompensate. So you were juggling the diaries, and you do the work and you know what needs to happen. But I find myself probably putting more in than I probably should do, because I enjoy my job and I get a lot out of my job. So that is, you know, I wouldn't do it if I didn't do that. But it also, I do feel committed that I had to do more for my organisation just to get that extra out, whilst balancing the work-life balance with my childcare. So I was interested how you managed that, or if you felt that. Maybe it's just me.
Okay, I'll go. So I think from a point of view of putting in and being seen to do the extra work, I think partially because I've worked for my employer for a long time and pre-children, I didn't necessarily feel that pressure as much. But yes, I want to be seen to be delivered. But I think one of the things that really helped me is there's a fantastic director in the London region called Helen Petterson, and I worked for her for past the pandemic, and she actually broached the conversation rather than me, and she just went, look, I don't care what hours you work, I don't care, I'm not about you doing 60, 80, 90, it does not matter the hours you work, I need you to deliver. So if these are the 3 things I need you to do, I need you to do it. I don't care whether it takes you 20 hours or 40 hours, that's what you're there to do. And that kind of really helped me reframe how I was thinking about it, because again, pre-kids, it was about the hours and what you did, and you wanted to be seen to do the volume. Whereas she was talking more about, actually, it's about the outputs, but it's about doing the essential outputs. And again, to the point that me and Mike were talking about earlier about prioritization, I almost rank my delivery. So I'll have 2 or 3 key things that I have to get done, and I know it'll either be that week or that day, and I have to make sure they get done. And if that means I work longer hours, it means I work longer hours. There'll be a couple of things that I know that actually I can take a little bit longer about and things. So that's kind of how I do it. And it's for me, it's really helped me to kind of reframe how I think about it, if that makes sense.
Put my hand up, Nicola, but I'm not quite sure why. I'm just now hardwired into doing that on a Teams meeting. Just to add to that, I think, Jane, we're all human, and inevitably you want to almost overcompensate. If you think you're getting a benefit, we need to normalise why do we think that is a benefit that we're getting. It should just be a normal expectation that you have children, you're a carer, that means to be done. But I'll be honest and frank about it, as a human being, yeah, there's always that temptation when I am doing it. If I've got to send an email, I'll send it last, and it comes in at 10 in the evening, and therefore people can see, oh, he must have made up the hours or whatever. But we've got to move more about, you know, what are people doing with that time. We've talked for God knows how long about presenteeism and stuff like that, and this is just another example of how it manifests. But it's all right to like your job as well if you want to do it. I think it's the issue here is about compulsion, I think, to do it, or feeling the social or work pressure to do it, as opposed to you maybe do just like work and that is one of the things you want to do.
Yeah, I think sometimes we put the pressure on ourselves rather than actually what others perceive that to be, and that's something that we'll probably are progressing through, and life does get better as they get a bit older anyway, so it does help.
I think that's right, Jane. I was going to add to that I mean, yes, like Mike, I definitely overcompensate, but I think that is just it's just a personality thing. But what I would say is I don't believe that I have ever felt the same level of, let's be candid about it, sort of judgment as women do, that they're supposed to be able to do everything. You know, they're supposed to be able to hold down a career and you know, and whether that judgment is completely abstract and is in your own head, or whether it comes from older family members, shall we say. Let's not name who they are, but you know what I mean. But I definitely think it's true that men in mine and Mike's position probably don't have that same level of external kind of expectation that you know that we will somehow make everything work.
Well, it's even worse sometimes, Henry. We're almost heralded as how marvellous we are because we're doing what should be the norm, which is really, really perverse.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks. Thank you for the question, Jane. And if there's a few comments and questions in the chat, if there's any other questions that people want to raise directly, feel free to raise your hand and we can pick those up live as well. Really interesting discussion so far. I like your point, Tor, around the boundaries as well of the role. I think that's really important. And personality types is a really interesting angle to it. Sometimes it's easier for others to have those conversations. I've definitely failed in my attempts to have some of those conversations in the past. Oh, we've got a question from Morgan. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. So it struck me that we're hearing from people who are relatively far on in their career and higher bandings here. It is so much easier, and I speak from experience, of saying, I'm going to do this now. And your manager will say, sure, because you have a certain level of responsibility. And you don't get to not do that work because it will be found out at some point. If you're in a lower band, it is much, much harder. And you may well be doing something that you cannot do from home. You know, we have cashiers. There's lots of people that are doing things within finance overseas, that kind of thing, where you cannot work from home. And the cost of childcare is astronomical. I'm kind of used to it now, but it really is. And because I had my child later in life, I was 38, it's easier. So you get, you know, younger people, different jobs. But even if you're actually otherwise, the costs of everything now is so much. I don't know what's being put in place for people who are at lower grades. And when the managers have so much pressure on them, they feel that they can't give that person who has children or caring responsibilities some allowance because other people don't. And I've heard that quite a lot, actually. Myself personally, I would just say, do you know what? Whatever works for you, we get your contracted hours in, etc. But it is quite difficult for managers to feel that they can do that with their team when you've equally got somebody saying, but I don't have children and I never will. That's not fair. I think following the pandemic, it's much easier because there's that little bit of flexibility. But at our trust, we're having people being asked, will they come in back to the office more often? I don't know. It's very tricky. What can we do for people who are in those lower bands? And has anybody seen it work well?
Oh, Henry, you've put your hand up. Well done.
I mean, I think all I can say is I 100% agree with everything Morgan said, and I think it does speak to a kind of broader issue about the anonymity of more junior staff generally, and about how, you know, and more junior staff find it harder to just ask for things which are completely rational and completely reasonable. I mean, I guess it's about individual organizational corporate culture, is it really? I suppose that sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but you know, where you have a more progressive kind of culture in place, which is put in by people who are a bit more enlightened and forward thinking, then hopefully more junior members of staff will feel less like they're under a kind of the oppression of the hierarchy, if you like, and they're able to ask for things which are entirely reasonable. But it feels like that is something that we need to tackle a bit more directly.
Mike, do you want to come in? Thanks, Henry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Henry that the more of us do this, the more normal it will become, and those that were more resistant will have to come along with us. I'm an honest believer of that, because eventually it's a market economy. You know, though we are all fishing in the same pond for talent, and if you are a progressive employer who works with your colleagues to make sure that things are better, you will win in that race for that talent. I'm a firm believer. So everyone will, even if it's just for selfish purposes, go along with it. The other part I would say is that, I mean, I am not going to sit here and pretend I understand how challenging it is for younger, more junior colleagues to be becoming parents when they become parents, or other forms of carers. I won't patronize people like that. But what we've got to do, I think, as leaders, is make sure it's clear we're wanting to listen to those people and listen to those challenges and actually adapt and change. We should be trying to make, as far as possible, these things are available. We won't hit perfect, because there will always be, we've heard, not just in finance, but a nurse cannot be a nurse on a ward from home. Well, that is true, but that shouldn't stop us making things better or easier for those people that we can make it better and easier for. So we shouldn't make the perfection is impossible. Let's not stop trying to do better and be good at all of these things. And let's also try and challenge ourselves in these extremely challenging financial times as leaders, not to take the knife and the cut straight to something that might be perceived as easy, which are if any of our people are providing on-site childcare that is, a salary sacrifice tax deductible, let's try and make sure that we protect some of these things as much as possible for our colleagues and staff, because they are vital.
Thanks, Mike. Great points as well from Henry. Thanks for the question, Morgan. Obviously, I think it sparked quite a lot of interest in the chat, that one as well, so you have a look through that one. As always, feel free to ask your questions directly. There's a question in the chat from Carol Cooper. Carol, I don't know whether you want to ask it directly yourself. This is around kind of health and well-being and managing.
It's okay, Sarah, you can ask the question.
Oh, go ahead, Carol, if you're there, please. Ask away.
Sorry, I haven't turned my camera on.
Don't worry.
Hi, yeah, I'm a parent as well. I've got 2 children. They are grown now, more Henry's daughter's age, and have been through that whole era of having to juggle work without having the home working hybrid option available. So long journey, but you get there. But I was just listening to the story. In particular, I'm a little bit biased. I'm now going to focus on Victoria as a female working mum. You have a lot of demands, and I'm not saying that the other two, your story, Victoria, you have a lot of demands, not just with your children, but your family and your work, and also you're talking about your mum as well. in terms of focusing on your own health and well-being, what time do you make for yourself? Because the more you carry on in this cycle, sometimes you don't lift your head up from above all of the situation. And if you're not careful, you can then become unwell and you're not able to help other people. So how do you focus on your own health and well-being, and what do you do to make time for yourself?
Thanks. That's a really helpful, I think, an interesting conversation to have. A colleague during the pandemic who I used to have regular one-to-ones with basically kind of recognised something similar both within herself and within me. And so what we'd do is every time we had a one-to-one, and this was more at the time when you were able to go out rather than just the once a day, we would always schedule a one-to-one and we'd go on a walk and talk to each other while when we do the one-to-one, go walking around the park or something else. So actually just so you're outside, so you don't always have to have, even if you are working, you don't have to have meetings actually inside sat at a desk. So that was kind of one part of it. And then as I started to get to the point where I was actually able to take a lunch break again, I got to the point where actually what I try and do is I try and go, and it depends on my diary, but I try and go on either a half an hour or an hour walk on my own at lunch if I can. I've taken up doing Couch to 5K, so some days I'm actually doing that instead. And you know, when I say half an hour to an hour, I totally understand that actually with my childcare responsibilities either end, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'd get all my hours done during the day, but sometimes actually if that means I'm doing half an hour in the evening but I've had an hour's decent exercise during the middle of the day when I haven't got my kids around, then sometimes it's worth doing that extra half an hour in the evening to get my work done. So but again, back to the points a lot of people have said, I don't think I'd have been able to do that pre-pandemic, hybrid working. But you're absolutely right. It's something I've actually had to intentionally think about doing. Because again, and you know, pre-pandemic, actually my exercise was walking to the train station, walking back from the train station. So that's something that I've lost. And I think that was another reason why I started getting into this habit of just going out and having a walk and doing some exercise. I don't know if that's quite answered your question.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Thanks, Carol, for asking that such an important question around one's healthcare resilience. I was thinking actually, how can I suggest that Victoria's friends take her on a spa day or something like that to recharge every now and then. But
we did that actually.
Yeah, well, that's quite a nice thing to do as well. But another question, as I said earlier, I think there's been quite a big shift in how parental responsibilities and caring have been kind of co-managed between in partnerships over the last 15 years. And a lot of that we have seen, quite a shift in cultural acceptance for both parents in a partnership to be involved in childcare. What changes would the panel like to see over the next sort of 10, 15 years in society as a whole, but in NHS finance specifically? And I'll ask first, I will ask Mike first.
Always terrible to be asked first. So yeah, put on the spot. I think there's something we haven't necessarily, I think Henry touched on a little bit, shared parental leave. It exists, but I have to say when we started looking into it, it literally made my brain hurt because it was like trying to find the magical doorway to Narnia. It was that difficult to navigate, and equally inevitably it almost became, I personally think, and only accessible when it was economically viable. One of the worst things you can do financially is become a parent. Let's be frank about it. It's the most expensive thing buying a house, and at the end of it you can't sell the kids. Believe me, I've looked into it. It's simply so challenging. Yet, and then at the way the current shared parental leave model works, financially it's just inhibiting to tons of people. So I would like to see that fundamentally changed, and the NHS really lobby for that to be changed, because I just think it's a bit of a shambles. It's neither one thing nor the other. I would like to hope that in the next 10 to 20 years it will become the norm, that we've got more shared parental responsibility, and it just becomes standard. It doesn't become something we have to talk about, and that in that we will start seeing a real shift in hopefully all parents. But let's be frank about it, that we are disproportionately disadvantaging women and female carers in this. That is just a fact. And so therefore, actually, the real acid test will we be seeing more women who are or are not carers in senior leadership, in finance, and in the rest of our organisations. That's the only acid test of what I'd like to see change. But I think the things we've got to understand is what are the key things we can change to enable that.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. And that's, I guess, why we're here and why this network exists, is to break down those barriers and discuss them openly. And some really good points coming through today. Henry, do you have anything to add to that? And we will come on to your point, Morgan, and Victoria as well.
Well, I know it's boring, Nicola, but I've got exactly the same point as Mike. I think I know it sounds like I'm repeating things, but I think it's just the single most important thing is not just that there are structures in place and that legally it becomes easy to do and financially kind of neutral, whether the one parent, both parents share. And sorry, we should also be careful about heteronormal language as well, because we should talk about shared parental leave and not, paternal leave is a term that sometimes people use, which is but where both parents can take the same amount of time off and it makes no difference, then extending that to it becoming normal. And if we do that, then as Mike says, if that becomes the norm and it is expected for a father or the non-birthing parent to share that, then this whole everyone in the workplace who has a child will experience the same career break, if you like, and that same disruption to their career. That means that it no longer becomes something which disproportionately affects one group of people. It affects everyone, and then it blends into the background, and that will then have a positive impact on the gender balance in terms of senior roles. It just will. We'll have, broadly speaking, a much more balanced profile of deputy directors, and CFOs. Obviously, there's a massive cultural piece to that as well, because then there would be also, I would like to think that would then have a different mindset to certain people, and misogyny would become less of a kind of natural thing that is embedded in people's kind of psyche, because you'd naturally experience the inconveniences and the challenges that other people experience. But maybe I'm getting slightly ahead of where society is going to be in the future, but we'll see.
I'd like to look forward to that. It's a shame my having baby days are over now. Victoria, do you want to add anything to that before we come on to Morgan's point?
Yeah, I'd probably add a couple of bits. So one of them is actually, so I think there's a few things. I think we need to look at what we view as leadership and how we actually talk to people and engage with people. So I had a very interesting conversation with a friend of mine from university who we all discovered at said spa day, actually, that she got all the way through to the very last stages to join the Navy as an officer, and everyone just went, huh? Quietest, most timid person you've ever met. And she said, yeah, I scored top on every single thing except for the leadership test, because they look for one style of leadership. And actually, to some extent, the NHS does something a bit similar. There's about 2 or 3 styles of leadership, and actually a lot of those tend to predominantly favour men. Not being harsh about it, but it is sort of like leadership style. And I think whenever we're kind of not looking at the different styles of both leadership or skill bases, we're going to continue to set up an environment that suits certain people over others. So I'd say that's probably my first point. My second point would be to the point about hybrid working, and that some organisations do have some great childcare offers, but people are working from home. So actually that's great if you're a nurse and you're going in and you're going to drop your child off at the office nursery. That's brilliant. But if you're actually predominantly now home working, we are the NHS, can't we access our local NHS provider, which may not be the one that we're working at, but can't we access childcare there? Could we have flexibility about using childcare across the NHS to give people more access? So that would probably be my my other point on that one. And then I think my final point would be, you know, as a mother returning from maternity leave, again, I suppose I've actually been very lucky in my career, not only to have good line managers, but to have some very good female line managers who have had some really good, strong influences. But one of them actually suggested when I came back my first time, she actually said, look, don't come straight back to work, come back on a phased return. So do 2 days, 3 days, couple of 4 days, and then go full time the following month, which actually was very, very helpful. One, to actually, I think for the first 2 weeks, could barely come back to work anyway because my IT was so screwed up. I spent the entire time on the phone. But actually that kind of helped get my head back into it. And I was lucky to come back into quite a structured environment where we had various different things on Teams. We had lists of things that needed to happen. So actually, from a point of view of actually when your memory isn't necessarily working at the kind of pace that it was before you went off, which I certainly found, and that may have been because of the IVF and all the hormones that got pumped through to me. And I'm sure, you know, I've spoken to colleagues actually who are going through the menopause. I think it's kind of a bit of a similar thing. Actually, structured environments really help people return to work as well, because it's easier to find things, it's easier to get yourself in. You're not having to ask people, and it feels like you're having to relearn to do your job. So I think there's that kind of part of it as well. So I think there's a number of different things that can also be done to help people come back from maternity, parental leave. And again, to Henry's point, that does not just necessarily mean the person who's necessarily given birth to the child. I mean, if you've taken 6 months out of work, it is a new start. There are things that would not just help people in this circumstances, it could help people for a whole variety of reasons returning to work.
Thanks, Tor. I agree with that. I think one of the things we looked at is across the network is running a webinar on that returning to work after an extended break for whatever reason, because things change and it can knock your confidence massively as well if you suddenly feel that you don't know where things are and who does what anymore. Morgan, we've got just a quick minute if you don't mind asking your question. We've had your hand up very patiently for a while, and then I'll do a bit of a wrap up. But yeah, over to you.
I have to be really quick because I'm going to be late for a meeting as well. I mean, where are these wonderful places that have nurseries on site? We used to, the land's been sold. But even then, you know, there aren't these places, you know, it's very difficult. The one thing I kind of wanted to think is we haven't covered, as this is for women in leadership, is the breastfeeding. You know, where's the allowance for people? If you want to share with your partner, male or not, then where's the allowance for that? And, you know, if you've made an informed choice, and you may not wish to, and that's absolutely fine, but the people that do want to. So that was one of the reasons I took a year off. And actually I breastfed until he was almost 3 years old. That's incredibly common now, but you won't, or becoming more common, but you won't hear about it. There are people breastfeeding their children until they're 5, 6 years old. Of course, that won't come into the workplace because they're at school. It only happens in the evening, perhaps. But we're not helping people who want to come back sooner, who want to go through all of the palaver of pumping. Once they've reached like a year, you don't really need to do that. But having to do that all the time, there's nowhere for them to go to. We're not allowing for people who want to chest feed or breastfeed. And I think that would be really good if employers focused on that.
Well, that's another interesting point, and I'm afraid we can't cover everything today. I think we've had so I'll do a bit of a wrap up just briefly because I know Henry has to dash off as well. Although I don't know if Mike and Tor are staying on, Sarah and I will stay on for another 10 minutes. But fantastic discussion. Thank you so much to Mike, Tor, and Henry for being so open, for sharing your personal situations with such frankness, but also in a really proactive way. I think hopefully the audience today will have found quite a lot of useful perspectives, tips, experiences that they can draw on or be inspired by. You know, even if you don't have the same understanding employer or team, or if you don't have some of the natural born privileges, or be at that stage of your career, there's still some useful perspectives here that hopefully people can benefit from. So thank you to the three of you. Thank you again, Sarah, for being my co-host today, for a fantastic introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joined the webinar today. This has actually been our highest attended webinar. So congratulations, you're part of history. Until the next one. But I think we had 170 people online. That's the highest we've ever had. So that's great news. So just really a couple of things for the Women in Leadership Network going forward. We have a really busy agenda planned for the rest of this year. We've got some webinars lined up, some really interesting speakers and topics, including, I think, hopefully we should be able to get Dr. Navina Evans. She said that she will attend one of our webinars, who's the Chief Workforce Officer for NHS England. Also, we're planning our next face-to-face event in the summer, which was such a hit last year. So yeah, we're following on from the success of that and starting to build a day that hopefully would work really well for everyone. So as ever, please continue to recommend our network to your friends, your colleagues. Remember, although it's Women in Leadership for Finance, it's not just for women. It's for anyone who wishes to ensure that we attract more women to senior leadership roles and that we're working towards gender equality across all levels in NHS finance. So thank you again for attending. If you do want to stay on, stay on. But otherwise, thanks for joining and have a lovely rest of the day.